We looked last week at Revelation 2 and 3, the letters to the 7 churches, viewing them as Jesus described them, the things which are, that pertain to this present age, and as such making up 7 historic time periods of the church age as a whole. And in that way we saw a kind of timetable for the gap between the 69th and 70th weeks of Daniel. We're going to be looking at 3 more sequences of 7 throughout the course of our study. And like the ones that we've already looked at, we're going to find that they're both sequential and they're chronological. They move events forward in time, giving us a framework in which to fit other events. This is especially important in Revelation because without these guides, we would be left to guesswork as to how to fit events into a chronology. And there is a lot of guesswork out there. There's a lot of teaching out there on end times and this teaching has good insights, but often you can see that the way to process the big picture is not there because somehow the person has missed these 7s that God has put in place to give us a framework. God is a God of order. He's given us all these prophetic scriptures for us to be able to understand what's going to happen and kind of track it as we see it happening. And so he wouldn't give us all this information without some kind of an orderly framework in which to process everything that's going to happen. So we're going to begin today with what comes next in the book of Revelation, the verse that we looked at the other day, chapter 4, verse 1, which begins the 3rd portion of the book of Revelation, the things which shall be hereafter, after this present age. So we're starting today with end time events. Now, this verse that we looked at last week where John hears a voice like a trumpet saying, "Come up hither, and I will show you things which must be hereafter." Some have felt that this is where the rapture takes place, that this is actually a reference to the rapture. And I would just like to suggest that with the level of importance that the New Testament places on the return of Jesus to gather his people to himself, and with how much focus there is on end time events, that to me it's unlikely that when that event finally is taking place in the book of Revelation, which is the primary prophetic book that we have in the New Testament that refers to things at the end, that the reference to so important an event would be so veiled, and the reference to it would be so indirect that we're kind of left to guess as to whether this really refers to the rapture or not. So as we go through events, we're going to keep our eyes open for a reference that may be much more direct in terms of it being the rapture of the church. Okay, chapter 4 deals with a scene in heaven. Chapter 5 continues with this scene in heaven. And in chapter 5 we see the Father sitting on the throne with a small book in his hand. And that's a scroll, actually, in the Greek, not a book as we know it. And there is a search being made for someone who is able to open the scroll and see what is contained in it. And it's a search for a man. It has to be a human being that does this. And we're told in verse 3 that there was no man in heaven, nor in earth, nor under the earth, which was qualified to open the scroll and look at its contents. And somehow John must have known intuitively either what this was about, or he knew that this was extremely important, because he says, "I wept much because no one was found worthy to open the scroll." But then one of the elders says, "Don't weep. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has been found worthy to open the scroll and to remove the seals from it. And then John saw Jesus as a lamb that had been slain. Jesus came forward and took the scroll out of the Father's hands. And then we see this, in verse 8, we see that the 24 elders and the 4 living creatures fall down before the Lamb, worshiping him for his having prevailed to take the scroll and to open the contents of it. And then after that, in verse 11, John looked and he saw 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of angels joining in this worship. The whole host of heaven stopped what they were doing and joined in the worship of Jesus as he takes this scroll. And then in verse 13, we see every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, in other words, within the earth, where hell is, the place of the dead, and all that are in them, in heaven and earth and in the sea. And he heard all of them. It's like everybody that's alive in the universe saying, blessing and honor and glory and power be unto him that sits on the throne and unto the Lamb forever and ever. I don't know of any other place in the scripture that has such an unbelievable, amazing outbreak of praise and worship of the Lord as we see when the Lamb takes this scroll. So we have to ask ourselves, what was the content of this scroll? Why was it so important? And of course, most of the book of Revelation, if not all, everything that follows, comes out of the opening of the scroll, and the scroll is revealed to us. And but what is it in a brief, in a summary form? Well, the scroll contains the title deed to the earth. The earth was given into the hands of man at creation. Man was to have dominion over it and rule over it. But man fell into the hands of the Lord's enemy. The Lord's enemy gained the place of dominion in the earth, and he subjugated and oppressed God's creation, the race of Adam. And we know that Jesus died and rose again to purchase back all of that had been lost. But we haven't seen the full redemption that Jesus actually purchased at the cross. The saints in heaven don't have their redeemed physical bodies, their spiritual bodies yet that they are to have. We on the earth still live in mortal bodies that are subject to aging and to death. And the earth is still under the dominion of Satan and the wicked men that will work with Satan to promote his purposes in the earth. So even though redemption has been purchased, the full possessing of it has not occurred yet. And that is what is contained in the scroll. It's the completion of the work of redemption. So that's why this is so significant, that the whole thing needs to be completed yet. And so now the scroll is going to bring us to our next series of 7 that we're going to look at, and that is the 7 seals that are on the outside of the scroll. Now, if we think of the scroll as being something like this, wrapped up, and then the seals go down the side of it, holding it shut, we can easily see that it's not enough to remove 1 seal or 2 or even 6, but all 7 seals have to come off before the scroll can be opened and the contents revealed. So, as we go through these seals, we're going to be comparing them with Jesus' primary teaching on the end times. And what you could do is have your thumb open in both Revelation chapter 6, which is where the seals are, and also Matthew 24, which is Matthew's account of the Olivet Discourse. Now, this is called the Olivet Discourse because Jesus gave this teaching to the disciples on the Mount of Olives. He did it just days before he died. He had just been telling the disciples that the temple was going to be laid flat with not one stone left on another. And so the disciples asked him, when is this going to happen? and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. And so the teaching that follows is Jesus answering these questions of the disciples. You'll notice in your notes that it's found in 3 different Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are all accounts of the same teaching. They're a little different from one another. And we're going to be using primarily Matthew's account of this as we go through it. So as we go through the seals, we're going to see a parallel, not only in events, but in the order of the events that Jesus gave in his teaching and with the releasing of the seals. So, and remember now, both things, Jesus said this is what will be happening at the end of the age. These are things by which you can recognize the approach of the end of the age and the approach of my return. And Revelation has said these are things that have to do with the hereafter. So both of these have to do with end time events. All right, let's start with the first seal in Revelation 6, verse 1. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard as it were the noise of thunder, one of the 4 beasts, the 4 living creatures, saying, Come, or in other words, be released, be going, come forth. He's saying that to this horse. And I saw and beheld a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. Okay, now let's see what the first thing was that Jesus spoke about in the Olivet Discourse. And we find that in verses 4 and 5. Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Okay. We see this rider in the first seal going forth on a white horse. And we know that Jesus is going to return on a white horse in Revelation 19. And this white horse rider in Revelation 6 has a bow with no arrows. A crown is given to him, and he goes forth conquering and to conquer. So he's going forth to acquire a kingdom. We know that Jesus already finished the work on Calvary that he's going to do. His work of overcoming was finished back then. And somehow this description of the white horse rider does not match the majesty and the glory with which the scriptures depict Jesus, especially in terms of end time events. So the primary reason, I believe, that this man goes forth on a white horse is to indicate to us that he is going forth trying to counterfeit the true Messiah. This man, this rider, is going forth making messianic claims. He's trying to come the same way that Jesus is going to return in. He's given a certain measure of authority, this crown, and he's going forth to gain a following, to gain peoples and land and wealth and whatever he can get on the earth, he's going forth to acquire and become the ruler over. And the parallel is that Jesus is saying, be careful of deception, for there will be many who come in my name claiming to be me, claiming to be not Jesus, but the Messiah, claiming that position of the anointed one who is worthy to gain worship and a following in the earth, who is worthy to rule over the earth. And so this is like the point in time when the Antichrist is launched out, going forth to gain a kingdom for himself in the earth. Now, we know that the 70th week of Daniel begins with this covenant between Antichrist and Israel. There really is no place in the New Testament that specifies that, okay, at this point in time, this covenant is being made. This is the official beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. But Bible scholars are pretty well agreed that both the Olivet Discourse and the seals of Revelation are the beginning of the 70th week. They are the time when Antichrist is going forth and he's on the move and he is practicing his wiles. He is not moving so much in an aggressive way as he is in a deceptive way to draw following after himself. So, we're going to say that this now, the first seal, paralleled with Jesus' warnings about deception, mark the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel in the New Testament as it unfolds at the end. Okay, now let's look at the second seal. When the second seal is released, we see a red horse rider coming forth with a great sword, and he removes peace from the earth. He goes forth in war. And what does Jesus say in Matthew 24? In verses 6 through the beginning of verse 7, he says, "There will be wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." So now we see war coming forth, great disruption of bloodshed throughout the earth. And Jesus told us at the end of verse 6 in Matthew 24, all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. See, now we're going to see that in response to the disciples' question, he is tracking things toward the end. But he says, this is going to happen, but the end is not yet. The third seal, we see a black horse rider with a set of balances. In other words, a scale, the weighing kind. And what we see is a measure of wheat costing a denarius, and 3 measures of barley for the same thing, a denarius. A denarius back in that day was approximately a day's wage. A measure of wheat was approximately enough food for one man for one day. So in other words, this scripture is telling us that there is great poverty. A man has to work all day long just to get enough food for that day. There is not money left over. And if you're really poor, you get barley because you get a greater amount of grain for the same amount of money. Barley was a cheaper food. But see that thou hurt not the oil and the wine. The oil and the wine are considered luxury foods. They're the food of the wealthy. And so what this tells us is that although there is subsistence living throughout most of the earth, there is still a different class of people that contain the wealth. That the wealth has become concentrated in the hands of a relatively few people. And what that tells us is that there's great injustice. There's great social and economic inequity. There's not fairness. There's injustice in the earth. And that the one group is probably oppressing and subjugating the other group and living off of them and exploiting them. We know that at the time of, we know that there have always been those in the earth that seek to take advantage of the poor and live off the poor. And it's interesting because back at the time, in the early 1900s, right before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, Russia was still ruled by the czars, and there was just grinding poverty among most of the people in Russia. But there was an upper class, an elite class that was very wealthy, that lived with great extravagance, just really out of touch with what poor people were going through. And when the Bolsheviks came along, they exploited that. They pointed that out to the people, and they fed resentment, and they fed seeds of rebellion. Like, you don't need to put up with this. You can cast this off, and if the Bolsheviks come to power, we'll make sure that everybody gets taken care of. And so they used this class warfare concept to promote their own rise to power, their own takeover of power. And this is going to be a big element in the rise of Antichrist at the end, which we'll refer to again in just a little while. Then, with the fourth seal released, we see the pale horse. Pale green is what it is in the Greek. Pale green horse coming forth. Riding on that horse are death, and hell follows after. Now, death is a spirit. it was the angel of death, the spirit of death that passed over Egypt so long ago, the night of the Passover, and killed the firstborn across the land. And there is an angel that guards hell. So these are powerful principalities, angels from the kingdom of darkness that are actually being released to go forth and accomplish these things in the earth at this time. Not just the death and hell, but the war and the inequity, the poverty. And in the fourth seal, we see that death and hell are given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and with wild beasts. And in the Olivet Discourse, we see Jesus saying there will be pestilences and earthquakes in various places. He's already talked about war and famines. So there's death from all these wars. There's death from the poverty, from famines, from people not having enough food. There's also death from wild beasts. And Jesus says from plagues, from pestilence, and from earthquakes, from natural disasters. And this is a huge number of people dying. And Jesus says in verse 8 of Matthew 24, all of these are the beginning of sorrows. In the Greek, that word sorrows is labor pains, birth pains. So the earth is convulsing in the beginning stages of labor, the labor which is going to usher in a whole new age on the earth, the age that Jesus will rule over. But we're not going to get to that age without some pain. And so we ask ourselves, this is Jesus releasing these things, and yet they bring so much sorrow and destruction to the earth. What's up with all this? What's the purpose for all these seal events that are so difficult? In the box that you have here in your notes, the first 4 seals, what we see is that though God is overseeing them, although Jesus is the one that's authorizing the going forth of all of these events, they're not coming from the hand of God as such, but He is allowing powerful spirits from the kingdom of darkness to go forth and bring about these events on the earth. So they are happening in a partnership between ungodly men who are willing to be servants of the enemy in promoting this disorder and this chaos and distress in the earth. All of this is to bring the earth into a place of readiness for the return of Christ. But it's in the purposes of God that before Christ returns, this end-time ruler called the Antichrist is allowed to rise in the earth and gain a following in the earth and draw many people after him, primarily by means of deception. And so part of the whole deception process is that with all this stuff going on in the earth, people are going to cry out for a leader. And the Antichrist will be rising, and he will be presenting himself as a Messiah figure. In other words, compassionate and caring and strong enough to bring order to all of this mess. He will rise up and he will say, well, of course there's oppression. There's always been oppression of the poor people. We need to have a ruler that will make sure that the poor are taken care of, that there's an equal distribution of wealth. And we need to have a ruler strong enough to end these tribal animosities that break out in war and these outbreaks, one nation against another. We need one world government, and we need a ruler that's strong enough to enforce the peace. So all of these things that are brought about by the seals are going to facilitate the rise of this end-time ruler into a place where people are going to say, yes, yes, he's who we need. He's the Messiah. He's the one anointed to bring peace to the earth and order to the earth so that everybody's taken care of and nobody gets away with this and that and this and that, okay? So You remember we talked last week about the hidden work of lawlessness, of sin that began in the church already in the first church age when the apostles were still alive. How Paul said this hidden work of lawlessness is already at work. Well, he was speaking about that in the context of the Antichrist. He was actually talking in 2 Thessalonians 2 about the rise of the Antichrist, which would occur before the return of Jesus. And it's in that context that he says this hidden work of lawlessness is already present among us. So we know that ever since the Tower of Babel, really ever since the fall in the garden, it's been Satan's goal to rise up into a place of dominion in the earth and gain a following, gain worship, and gain authority and control in the earth. But God gave that to man. So Satan has had to get it through man. He's had to get men that would follow him and yield themselves to him and embrace his agenda and get on board so that they could speak the things of darkness that would release his power in the earth and release his activity in the earth. And yet, Paul says in that same chapter in 2 Thessalonians 2, he said, there's been a restraint. There is a hindrance on the development of this mystery of iniquity so that Satan is not able to do all that he wants to do when he wants to do it. He's been ready to do it all along. But there has been a restraint on him that now, as these seals unfold, is lifted. That restraint is lifted from the enemy, and the mystery of iniquity now is going to be allowed to grow and bloom and come forth in this final end-time ruler and the kingdom that he will rule over. And we're going to talk about the kingdom in just a moment. Before we get to the kingdom, I want to look at a few final things in this portion of Matthew 24.